Our next step, we're going to put on the power steering pump. Now we have two connections. We have our pressure line and our return line. So it's probably easiest to put on the return line first because it's just an easy fit. So I'm going to actually put on the pressure line first because it's a little bit harder. So, and I can't really get you down inside there, but as you can see, it just got this one connection there and that one connection. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. I'll come back in a minute. Okay, so now what I've done, I hooked up the power steering pump pressure hose first, then I hooked up the return hose, and you don't want to do it in the opposite direction because if you do, it's really difficult to work around that return hose to get that pressure line in. So make sure you get the pressure line on first, then the return hose. Now I've also jacked up the engine, and I'm going to line up the first bolt for the power steering pump. Kind of thread that in by hand. And you have to move the pulley so that you can access the bolt. And then we have two more bolts here on the bottom, and I'll go ahead and zip those down. Alright, now that we've got the power steering pump in, I'm going to connect the PVC valve. Alright, now we have this bracket to put on. Now I really can't get you down in there, but I'm just going to kind of show you how this goes into position. What it does is it connects to the bottom of the block and then to the back of the intake manifold. It's just reinforcement, but we also have another bolt that connects to here. So I'm going to go ahead and zip this down since I can't get you in there and hold this at the same time. I'm just going to tighten this down, but this is how it's positioned in there. It goes to the block and then to the intake manifold. Alright, let me show you how that bracket's mounted. Got one bolt right here, another one going down right down here by the block, and then we've got this little bracket that comes out this way. So we have another little support that comes from here and mounts to another one of these pieces of hardware. So now our next step is going to be installing our fuel lines. Okay, so we have a return and then we have our pressure line, and they just basically snap into place. You have to line up these little plastic clips like that, and it just snaps in. This one is just a pressure fit, so they're really easy to get off. A little harder to actually get off than they are to get on, and then just kind of tug on them, make sure they're in place. Then we will bring our wires up that we have. We have our throttle cable, so we'll go ahead and connect that up now. Alright, I realized I had to run the throttle cable actually up through the top of the intake manifold. Then it connects right here, pushes in, connects to this little rod. So I'm just going to connect that up right now. This piece right here actually connects right into here, but I can't hold it and do it at the same time, so I'm just going to do it right here. Okay, I decided to reposition the camera so you guys can see better. So the throttle cable goes in here, and then you just got to squeeze it down, connect it. Okay, and then just move the cable. Like that, okay, and just let it come through, and then snaps into place, and there you go. There's the throttle cable. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to install the idle control valve and the throttle positioning sensor, which go right back over here. Okay, they're only you can only plug in one way. Now we're going to plug in the EGR valve, which is right here, and it only plugs in one way. And then there's a connector that connects to the wire right here. I'm just going to go and connect that wire, the wire loom. Then we got one ground cable that connects right here. Then we have two more that connect to this bolt. Then we'll grab those lugs and tighten those down. Alright, so we're just going to tighten down these ground bolts. Now you can wire this however you want. Probably like that be better. Okay, then we have two sensors that plug into the head. You have a coolant sensor. Okay, and then you have another sensor that measures, I don't know exactly what it measures, but they only go on one way. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that's it for the wiring. All we have left is the coil pack. We'll install that now, but all this wiring is all done. We still have a tube that we need to connect from here that goes down to the firewall, this tube right here. We got to pull that up, connect that to the top, and that should be pretty much it for installing the intake manifold. Right now we're going to put the coil pack in. We have 4 8mm bolts, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top, and then we just have our connectors that plug into the top. One's bigger than the other, so it's going to do that now. Alright, our next step is where you're going to install the coil to the spark plugs, and it should pretty much go right back the way it came apart. So the longest one's here all the way over. I will check that, double check the firing order and whatnot. That's pretty much it for this whole section. The only thing that's really left here is to install the battery tray and the battery, but I'm going to go ahead and move over to the front. We're going to install the AC pump, bolt it down, put the fan back in, and we'll go from there. Before we put the AC pump on, I think what I want to do is get my power steering hose on, partly because it's kind of hard to get to once we put the AC pump on. So I'm going to put that in place first, then I will come back and install this. Alright, now to install the AC pump, we have 3 13mm bolts here and 3 10mm bolts here in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and get it in position, lock down the bolts, and then we will go ahead and start with putting on the bottom pulley on the underneath. Alright, one trick I wanted to show you, I always leave that bottom motor mount unhooked till I'm completely done. Reason being is, watch how much I can raise up this engine. I can access a lot of these bolts and the fasteners in this section here because it's so tight. So I leave that unbolted. And look how much access I have to all these bolts and hardware. That's what I find is the best way to do it. So now I can tighten down the AC pump, and I can get to all the brackets and put the pulleys on. It works really well. Alright, on this bottom bracket, or the back bracket of the AC pump, you want to look at these bolts. You want to release these two, and then the two on the bottom here, so that you can align this and kind of move it around. Because if not, it's just a really tight fit, and sometimes you might cross thread it. So just make sure these two are loose, and the ones on the bottom are loose. Then tighten up these 2, or the 3 on the back side here, and then you can tighten these back down and tighten this down. That way you don't cross thread. Okay, now we're just going to install the connector for the AC pump, and that is done. Now I still have a purge solenoid. Oh, sorry, not purge solenoid. I have an overflow tube that needs to come and connect to this top of the head over here. We'll do that in just a sec. I'm going to start doing this side, getting this all buttoned up, get the belts on. Then when I go to put the battery in, then I will put that little tube on the head and put the battery in, then put the fan in, and we should pretty much be done. We might have to just mount up the exhaust manifold underneath, but other than that, we'll be pretty close to done. Now our next step is just go ahead and put the pulley on for the crankshaft. Put the bolt in place. It's a 22mm. and now I'm going to actually put the belt on now. Then I'm going to come back and do the bottom motor mount. Reason being, that way if I leave the motor mount off right now, I can actually have more access to get the belt on. Once I get the belt on, then I go and put the motor mount on, and I can go from there. Okay, now I'm going to jack up the engine. Now we're going to lower it back down so we can get that bottom motor mount in place. Okay, so here's the bottom motor mount. This goes up in position like this. And then I'm going to grab, they sometimes call this the lower dog bone, and this connects the motor mount to the subframe. Take you a little closer. Okay, so I tightened up the 4 bolts. It's kind of hard to get us both in there at the same time. Now I'm going to jack up the engine just a little bit, just so I can get the dog bone in position. Okay, so the big end goes here, little end goes here. Then I'll put the bolts in. Now it's kind of, sometimes you have to wiggle the engine a little bit to get it in position. Maybe I'll even have to lower the engine down just a smidge. Just so that I can get the dog bone lined up. Now one of these bolts is longer than the other, so you want to make sure you get the right one in there the first time around. You see one's longer than the other. The longer one goes on the cradle, the shorter one actually goes on the motor mount. And I will zip those down. Alright, now I don't know how many of you remember when we pulled the engine out, we actually removed this motor mount bracket. So it's a little easier to get the engine in and out. So we do have to put it back in because the upper mount mounts to here. So what I'm going to do is I've removed the bolt from down here so that the dog bone can let that engine go up just a little bit higher. Now the motor mount's still bolted, but the dog bone's released. So now it gives me a little bit more clearance so that I can tighten this down. Now what we have is we have 4 10mm bolts on the top. Then we have 3 right here that go on the inside of the fender that you have to access from inside here, inside this area. So I'm going to go ahead and install that and put that back in its position. It's kind of awkward to get in there. We have to use like a combination open-end wrench to get these ones in. And so I'm going to go ahead and install that now. Alright, now we got this motor mount bolted in. 2 bolts down here, 2 bolts down here, and then we have 3 bolts right here. 1, 2, 3 behind this actual panel. So now that that's in position, we go ahead and lower the motor down and install the upper motor mount, which if you haven't seen my video on how to install that, the description will be down below. We'll bolt this bad boy back into position. Then we will put the bottom dog bone in and the motor will be completely installed.